The office had emptied hours ago, but Daniel Brooks remained at his desk. The blue glow of his monitor cast long shadows across the cubicle walls. He wasn't working overtime for ambition or recognition. He was simply waiting for Malene Cross to finish reviewing the quarterly reports because she'd asked him to stay. And when the CEO asks, you stay. What he hadn't expected was for her to appear at his desk, phone in hand, a rare uncertainty flickering across her features. She needed help with her dating profile, she said. Just technical feedback, nothing personal. Daniel nodded, keeping his expression neutral as he scrolled through the carefully curated images and precisely worded descriptions. After a long moment, he looked up and told her the truth. The profile was too polished, too controlled. It read like a resume, not an invitation. Malene stared at the screen for several seconds, then lifted her gaze to meet his. The smile that crossed her face was nothing like the measured expressions she wore in boardrooms. It was softer, almost vulnerable. "Why not take me out?" she asked quietly. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs, not because of the words themselves, but because he understood instantly that something fundamental had just shifted between them, and there would be no pretending otherwise. Daniel Brooks had spent the better part of his adult life perfecting the art of restraint. At 36, he'd learned that knowing when to step back was often more valuable than knowing when to push forward. This philosophy governed everything from his approach to fatherhood to his conduct at Mercer and Holden, the investment firm where he'd worked as a senior analyst for the past 4 years. His mornings began early before his 7-year-old daughter Emma stirred in her bedroom down the hall. He would brew coffee in the small kitchen of their 2-bedroom apartment in Hoboken, reviewing market reports on his laptop while the sky lightened over the Manhattan skyline visible through their window. By breakfast time, he was preparing Emma's meal, usually scrambled eggs and toast, sometimes pancakes if it was a weekend or if she'd had a particularly rough day at school. He'd learned to read her moods from the way she shuffled into the kitchen, the angle of her shoulders, the brightness or dimness in her eyes. Single fatherhood had made him fluent in a language that most men never had to learn. Emma's mother had left when their daughter was 2, not dramatically, not cruelly, just decisively. She'd realized, she said, that she wasn't built for this life, this smallness, this routine. Daniel had watched her pack her suitcases with a numbness that took months to thaw into grief. By the time the grief arrived, he was too busy changing diapers and warming bottles to fully inhabit it. Perhaps that was a blessing, or perhaps he'd simply learned to compartmentalize so effectively that certain rooms in his heart remained permanently sealed. At work, Daniel was known for his precision and his discretion. He spoke in meetings only when he had something worth saying. He never lingered at office happy hours, always citing Emma's bedtime as his reason for leaving early. His colleagues respected him without really knowing him, which suited Daniel perfectly. Connection, he'd learned, came with complications he couldn't afford. Malene Cross existed in an entirely different stratosphere. At 41, she'd built Mercer and Holden from a struggling boutique firm into a financial powerhouse with offices in New York, London, and Singapore. Magazine profiles described her as brilliant and ruthless, a combination that seemed to fascinate and terrify the business world in equal measure. What they rarely mentioned was the loneliness that accompanied such singular focus. Daniel had observed her over his years at the firm, not with romantic interest, he would have insisted, but with the careful attention of someone who understood that survival often depended on reading the room correctly. He noticed that she stayed later than anyone else, that her corner office light was always the last to go dark. He noticed that men who tried to charm her invariably retreated within weeks, and that she attended industry galas alone, despite being one of the most sought-after names on invitation lists. She was, he realized, surrounded by people who wanted something from her, whether access, influence, or the prestige of association. What she lacked was someone who saw her as simply a person, complicated and uncertain and searching, just like everyone else. Their interactions had been minimal before that evening. Quarterly reviews, occasional strategy sessions, the polite exchanges of 2 people who orbited the same professional space without truly intersecting. But Daniel had noticed something in those brief encounters, a quality in her attention when she listened to him speak. She didn't just hear his words. She seemed to weigh them, to consider them with genuine interest. It was subtle enough that he might have imagined it, yet something in him recognized it anyway. When she appeared at his desk that night with her phone extended, Daniel understood that she was showing him something she rarely let anyone see. The woman behind the title, uncertain and searching and tired of performing strength. He could have deflected with a joke. He could have offered empty reassurance. Instead, he told her the truth because he suspected she hadn't heard it in a very long time. What Daniel hadn't anticipated was the invitation that followed. Nor had he anticipated the sudden, unmistakable certainty that he was standing at a threshold he'd spent years carefully avoiding. The dating profile glowed on the phone screen between them, and Daniel found himself studying it with the same analytical precision he applied to market trends. 3 photographs. Malene in a tailored blazer at some industry event. Malene on what appeared to be a yacht in the Mediterranean. Malene standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office with the Manhattan skyline sprawling behind her. Every image projected success, power, unassailability. Every image, Daniel realized, was designed to intimidate. He scrolled to the biography section. The language was equally formidable. Seeking intellectual equal with global perspective, must appreciate fine dining, cultural institutions, and stimulating discourse. There was a list of requirements that read more like job qualifications than dating preferences. Advanced degree preferred, international travel experience, familiarity with contemporary art and classical music. You wrote this to filter people out, Daniel said finally, his voice quiet in the empty office. Not to invite them in. Malene's expression flickered, a brief crack in the composed facade she wore like armor. Efficiency matters in dating as much as business. Why waste time on incompatible candidates? Candidates? Daniel set the phone down on his desk. You're not hiring a vice president. You're looking for a partner. Is there a meaningful difference? The question landed with more weight than she'd probably intended. Daniel considered his response carefully. When I interview candidates, I'm evaluating their qualifications against predetermined criteria. When I was dating, before I wasn't, I was looking for something I couldn't quantify. Chemistry, comfort, the sense that someone saw me, not my resume. Malene was silent for a long moment. The hum of the building's ventilation system seemed suddenly loud in the stillness. Men are intimidated by me, she said finally. They approach with confidence, learn who I am and retreat. The ones who stay want access or validation, not connection. I thought if I set the bar high enough, I might attract someone capable of meeting it. Or you might ensure that no one tries. The words hung in the air. Daniel half expected her to bristle, to reassert the professional distance between them. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, regarding him with something that looked almost like curiosity. You're suggesting I've constructed barriers unconsciously. I'm suggesting your profile reads like a warning label. Approach only if you're confident enough to survive scrutiny. Most people, even accomplished ones, don't want to feel like they're being evaluated. They want to feel wanted. Malene's gaze drifted to the window, to the city lights twinkling beyond the glass. And what would you suggest instead? Write it like you're a person, not a position. Mention the things you love, not the credentials you require. Let someone imagine sitting across from you at breakfast, not negotiating a merger. The silence that followed was different, charged with something Daniel couldn't quite name. When Malene spoke again, her voice was lower, almost uncertain. Would you help me rewrite it? Not as an employee, just as someone who clearly sees things I've missed. Daniel knew he should decline. Every instinct honed by years of careful boundary maintenance screamed at him to retreat to the safety of professional distance. But something in her question, something vulnerable and genuine, made refusal feel like cowardice. All right, he said, but we do it honestly. No curated perfection, just who you actually are. For the first time since he'd known her, Malene Cross looked genuinely surprised. And beneath the surprise, something that might have been hope. They began that night, sitting side by side at Daniel's desk, the glow of his monitor casting soft light across their faces. Malene had pulled a chair over, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive that he couldn't identify. He tried not to think about that. Tell me about your mornings, Daniel said. Not the ones where you're running a company, the ones where you're just existing. Malene frowned slightly. Most of my mornings involve running a company. Before that, before the emails and the calls, what's the first thing you do when you wake up? She was quiet for a moment, and Daniel watched something shift in her expression, a softening around the eyes that he'd never seen in boardroom settings. I make tea, she said finally. Earl Grey, very strong with a little honey. I stand at my kitchen window and watch the sunrise over the park. Those few minutes before the world starts demanding things from me, they're the only peace I have most days.